Margaret Hill tightened her grip on the leather-bound ledger, the weight of its revelations pressing heavily on her chest. The city outside her window buzzed with muted activity, but her focus remained locked on the names scrawled across the pages. This book wasn't just evidence, it was a map of betrayal, implicating not only Greg Hannon, but the rot that spread through the entire system. The precinct raid was a public spectacle, yet the real battle loomed in the shadows. She knew Hannon's defiance wasn't bravado, it was a challenge. As Margaret flipped to a page marked with bold red ink, a faint smile tugged at her lips. He believed his connections would save him, that his network of power would insulate him from justice. But Margaret had faced down worse odds before. This time, she murmured to herself, her voice steady with resolve, they won't escape the light. But before we dive into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another gripping story. The cold gnawed at the edges of Ryan Steele's senses as he adjusted himself in the cramped confines of his squad car. A thin stream of icy air crept through a crack in the window, stinging his exposed skin. He ignored it, his focus drifting to the dimly lit streets stretching endlessly before him, their shadows alive with unspoken menace. This was his territory, an urban wasteland of crumbling facades and flickering neon signs. He was the law here, but his authority felt like a flimsy shield against the relentless tide of crime. Ryan leaned back, his gloved hands tightening around the steering wheel. His thoughts churned with bitterness. East streets are a breeding ground for trouble. No one cares about fixing their lives here, and I'm supposed to babysit them? Pathetic! The police scanner crackled faintly in the background, punctuating the silence with intermittent bursts of static. Nothing significant. Another uneventful night. The monotony gnawed at him, feeding his growing disdain for the people he was sworn to protect. In his mind, they were complicit in their own misery, content to wallow in the filth of their choices. He reached for his thermos, contemplating a late-night coffee run, when a flicker of movement caught his attention. His eyes sharpened, locking onto a lone figure standing under a sputtering street lamp. It was an elderly woman. Her oversized coat hung loosely from her frail frame, and she leaned heavily on a cane. A plastic grocery bag dangled from her hand, swaying slightly in the chill breeze. Ryan's jaw tightened. What's an old woman like her doing out here at this hour? No way this is innocent. The engine growled as he turned the key, the headlights bathing the street in a harsh, unflattering light. The figure remained still, her silhouette stoic against the decaying backdrop of the boarded-up store behind her. Ryan eased the squad car forward, his suspicions solidifying with each passing second. Something about her presence didn't sit right with him. He parked abruptly, the screech of the tires echoing off the empty buildings. The sound hung in the air, amplifying the weight of the moment. As he stepped out, the cold enveloped him, sharp and unforgiving. His hand brushed against the holster of his flashlight, a habitual gesture, but one that brought him a small measure of comfort. The air seemed to grow denser as he approached, his boots crunching against the uneven pavement. "Ma'am?" he called out, his voice clipped and authoritative. "What are you doing here?" The woman didn't flinch. Slowly, she turned her head, her weathered face catching the pale glow of the street lamp. Her eyes met his, calm, unyielding, and far too composed for someone in her position. "Just getting home," she replied evenly, her voice carrying a faint tremor. "Is that a crime now?" Ryan's brow furrowed. Her quiet defiance irritated him, a subtle challenge to his authority. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "This neighborhood's bad enough without people wandering around at odd hours," he said, his tone hardening. "Who are you meeting?" The woman arched an eyebrow, her grip tightening on the cane. "No one, just bought some groceries." Ryan's eyes flicked to the bag, then gestured toward it. "Let me see." For a moment she hesitated, then sighed, lifting the bag. The mundane contents, bread, a carton of milk, and a tin of soup mocked his suspicions. Frustration flared in his chest. "ID!" he demanded sharply. "Now!" The woman let out a weary sigh, reaching into her coat pocket. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as if to emphasize the absurdity of the situation. She handed him a worn wallet, her fingers brushing against his glove. Ryan flipped it open, scanning the ID. Margaret Hill, 64 years old. Her calm demeanor grated on him further, fueling the ember of anger smoldering in his chest. "You don't need to treat me this way," she said softly, her voice tinged with quiet resolve. "I've done nothing wrong." Ryan's patience snapped. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he snarled, his grip tightening on the ID. He moved closer, his towering frame casting a menacing shadow over her. The woman didn't retreat. Her chin lifted slightly in defiance. "Let go of me," she said firmly as he grabbed her arm. "I'm not afraid of you, Officer Steele." Her words hit him like a slap, freezing him in place. How does she know my name? The question ricocheted through his mind, momentarily unsettling him. But anger was a familiar refuge, and he clung to it. Her composure felt like mockery, her defiance a challenge he couldn't ignore. His vision blurred with rage, and he lashed out, his fist connecting with her jaw in a sickening thud. The force sent her stumbling, groceries scattering across the pavement. A tin of soup rolled into the gutter, its metallic clink echoing eerily in the silence. Margaret fell to one knee, her cane clattering to the ground. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, but her eyes burned with quiet intensity as she looked up at him. "You'll regret that, officer," she said, her voice low and steady. Before Ryan could respond, she reached into her coat pocket. His instincts flared, and he gripped his flashlight tightly, ready to escalate further. But what she pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a badge. A gleaming FBI badge. The sight of it stopped him cold, the weight of his actions crashing down on him like a tidal wave. "Special Agent Margaret Hill," she said, her tone laced with icy professionalism. "Undercover. Congratulations, Officer Steele. You've just made a career-ending mistake." Her words hung in the air, sharp and cutting as the distant wail of sirens broke the tension. Ryan's world tilted, his confidence crumbling under the gravity of her revelation. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was the beginning of his downfall. The sirens in the distance grew louder, their echoes slicing through the stillness of the night. Margaret remained steady, her composure almost unnerving as Ryan loomed over her. The metallic tang of tension lingered in the air, sharp and palpable, as if the city itself had paused to witness the clash. Ryan squared his shoulders, his tone cut through the silence like a blade. "Explain yourself. What are you doing here? Who are you meeting?" Margaret didn't flinch. She raised her eyes slowly, deliberately, and met his gaze. The flickering street lamp above cast a soft glow on her face, accentuating the lines etched by time and experience. Her voice, calm and measured, broke through the cold night air. "Just getting home. Is that a crime now?" Her response felt like a slap to his ego, and Ryan's jaw tightened. He had expected fear, hesitation, maybe even an excuse. But this quiet defiance stoked the simmering fire within him. The corners of his mouth tightened into a grim line as he stepped closer, his boots pressing heavily into the pavement. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice low and menacing. "This neighborhood's bad enough without people like you hanging around. Show me what's in the bag." Margaret hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly as if calculating his next move. Then, with a resigned sigh, she lifted the plastic bag, revealing its mundane contents: a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a tin of soup. The items swayed gently as the wind brushed against the thin plastic. Ryan's eyes flicked over the groceries, their mundane nature mocking the intensity of his suspicion. Instead of quelling his irritation, the sight only fueled it further. Heat rose in his chest, his frustration bubbling into anger. ID, he barked, his words cutting through the stillness like a whip. You think I'm playing? Hand over your ID now, or we'll have a problem. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a fleeting moment, her gaze flickered with something akin to pity. Slowly, she reached into her coat pocket, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Ryan's hand instinctively hovered near his flashlight, his muscles tensing as he watched her fingers disappear into the folds of fabric. When her hand re-emerged, it held a worn leather wallet. Without a word, she handed it to him. Ryan snatched it from her grasp, his gloved fingers brushing against the weathered leather. He flipped it open, the edges of the ID card catching the dim light. Margaret Hill, 64 years old. The name was unremarkable, the details unassuming, but something about her quiet defiance unsettled him. It was as if she was daring him to push further, to expose the depth of his own prejudice. "You don't need to treat me this way," Margaret said softly, her voice carrying a note of quiet strength that only fanned the flames of his anger. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he snapped, his voice sharp and cutting. The words echoed in the empty street, each syllable dripping with venom. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not," she said simply. "But you're making a mistake." The statement hit him like a jolt, though he refused to show it. Instead, he stepped even closer, his presence looming over her like a dark cloud. His hand shot out, gripping her arm with force. "Let go of me!" Margaret demanded, her voice slicing through the tension like a razor. Her eyes, steady and unwavering, locked onto his. "I'm not afraid of you, Officer Steele." The use of his name sent a chill down Ryan's spine. For a split second, his grip on her arm faltered. How did she know his name? The thought buzzed in his mind like an insect trapped against a window pane. But instead of retreating, Ryan's anger surged, overpowering the flicker of doubt. Her calmness felt like an affront, her composure a silent indictment of his authority. He tightened his grip, his knuckles whitening under the pressure. "You think this is a game?" he growled. "You think you can just—" But before he could finish, Margaret's voice cut through his tirade like a knife. "You're going to regret this," she said, her tone steady and deliberate. Her words carried an air of certainty that made Ryan's stomach twist. "You don't tell me what I'll regret," Ryan barked, his face inches from hers. "I'm the law here." The declaration hung in the air, heavy and unchallenged, yet Margaret didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket once again. The movement was slow, deliberate, and Ryan's instincts flared. "Ah, stop," he commanded, his hand flying to his holster. The cold metal of his flashlight pressed against his palm as he raised it defensively. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing like a drum. Margaret's hand emerged from her pocket, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Ryan's grip on the flashlight tightened as his mind raced, bracing for the worst. But what she held wasn't a weapon. It was a badge. A gleaming emblem of authority that caught the light and seemed to burn its image into Ryan's vision. The sight of it sent a jolt through his system, freezing him in place. Margaret straightened, her presence suddenly commanding despite her diminutive frame. "Special Agent Margaret Hill," she announced, her voice carrying a sharp edge of professionalism. "Undercover." Ryan's breath caught in his throat as the weight of her words crashed down on him. The flashlight in his hand trembled slightly, his grip faltering under the gravity of the moment. "You've just made a career-ending mistake, officer," Margaret continued, her tone colder than the night air. Her words sliced through the silence, each one landing like a hammer blow. The distant wail of sirens broke through the haze of shock that had enveloped Ryan. They grew louder with each passing second, closing in like the footsteps of judgment. His world, once firmly within his grasp, was now slipping through his fingers. Margaret didn't look away, her gaze unwavering as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street. "You thought you were untouchable," she said, her voice low but laced with resolve. "But the law applies to you too." Ryan's mind spun, his thoughts tumbling over each other in a chaotic blur. Panic clawed at his chest as the reality of his situation began to sink in. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was the beginning of his downfall. The tension in the air thickened as Margaret straightened her posture, her badge gleaming faintly under the sputtering light. The distant sirens faded into the background, their urgency drowned out by the electric intensity of the moment. Ryan stood frozen, his mind grappling with the ramifications of what he had just done. But the pause was fleeting, replaced almost instantly by a surge of defensive anger. Margaret, still calm despite the escalating situation, lowered her hand with deliberate slowness. "You don't need to treat me this way," she said softly, her tone devoid of malice, yet brimming with quiet resolve. "I've done nothing wrong." Her words felt like an accusation, one that cut deeper than she likely intended. Ryan's frustration boiled over, his response snapping like a taut wire under pressure. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he snarled. The harshness in his voice echoed down the empty street, a futile attempt to reassert control over a situation that was quickly spiraling out of his hands. Margaret's gaze remained steady, her calm demeanor an unspoken challenge to his authority. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable, yet her silence spoke volumes. "Are you deaf?" Ryan barked, stepping closer. "I said—" Before he could finish, Margaret's voice cut through his tirade like a scalpel. "Let go of me," she said firmly as his hand clamped down on her arm. Her tone was calm, but it carried an unmistakable edge of defiance. "I'm not afraid of you, Officer Steele." The use of his name struck him like a lightning bolt, momentarily halting his momentum. His grip faltered as the realization planted a seed of doubt in his mind. How did she know his name? Was she bluffing? The questions swirled in his head, but he quickly buried them under a renewed surge of anger. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Ryan growled, tightening his grip. His fingers pressed into the fabric of her coat, the physical contact a desperate attempt to regain control. "This isn't a game." Margaret's eyes didn't waver. "No, it isn't," she replied, her voice unyielding. "But your behavior is unacceptable." Her calmness, her refusal to cower, stoked the flames of Ryan's anger. He leaned in closer, his face mere inches from hers. "Do you know who you're talking to?" He spat, his voice low and dangerous. Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "Yes," she said simply, her tone steady. "An officer who's lost sight of his duty." The words were a dagger to his pride. Ryan felt the weight of her statement settle in his chest like a stone. Instead of introspection, however, he lashed out, his frustration reaching a boiling point. He yanked her arm roughly, causing her to stumble. Margaret caught herself, her cane clattering to the ground as she steadied her balance. But her expression didn't falter, nor did her resolve. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice as calm as ever. "And you're too blinded by your anger to see it." Ryan's vision blurred with rage. His grip on her arm tightened, his knuckles turning white. He opened his mouth to retort, but the words caught in his throat when Margaret did something unexpected. She smiled. It was faint, barely perceptible, but unmistakably there. A ghost of amusement that danced on the edges of her lips. To Ryan, it felt like mockery, as though she saw through the brittle facade of his authority. Her smile only deepened his anger, feeding the fire threatening to consume him. "You think this is funny?" he snarled, shaking her slightly. "Do you have any idea who you're messing with?" Margaret's smile faded, replaced by an expression of quiet determination. "Yes," she said again, her voice calm but resolute. "Someone who doesn't deserve the badge he's wearing." Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for a moment, Ryan was at a loss. The accusation stung more than he wanted to admit, but he refused to let it show. Instead, He leaned into his anger, using it as a shield against the uncomfortable truth. "You're going to regret this," he hissed, his voice laced with venom. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her expression unchanging. "Neither do you," she said softly, her cryptic statement adding another layer of tension to the already volatile situation. Ryan's mind raced, the seed of doubt she had planted beginning to take root. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Her calmness, her refusal to back down, and the way she seemed to know more than she was letting on. It all felt wrong, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit it, not even to himself. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, faint but growing louder. Ryan's grip on Margaret's arm loosened slightly as his attention shifted toward the approaching figures. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street, casting long shadows across the pavement. Margaret took the opportunity to pull her arm free, stepping back as the first federal agent rounded the corner. She straightened her coat, brushing off the fabric as if to erase the evidence of Ryan's aggression. But her eyes never left his, the intensity of her gaze unbroken. "You're done, Officer Steele," she said, her voice low but firm. "You just don't realize it yet." Ryan's stomach churned as the realization began to sink in. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was something much bigger, something he hadn't anticipated. He glanced at the approaching agents, their expressions grim and determined, and felt the first pangs of panic clawing at the edges of his composure. Margaret, meanwhile, remained steady, her demeanor unchanged despite the chaos unfolding around her. "You brought this on yourself," she said softly, her tone carrying an air of finality. "Now you'll face the consequences." Ryan's world tilted as the agents closed in, their voices a cacophony of commands and questions. For the first time, he felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him, suffocating, inescapable. And as he looked into Margaret's unwavering gaze, he realized that she had been right all along. The game was over. The tension in the air thickened as Margaret straightened her posture, her badge gleaming faintly under the sputtering light. The distant sirens faded into the background, their urgency drowned out by the electric intensity of the moment. Ryan stood frozen, his mind grappling with the ramifications of what he had just done. But the pause was fleeting, replaced almost instantly by a surge of defensive anger. Margaret, still calm despite the escalating situation, lowered her hand with deliberate slowness. "You don't need to treat me this way," she said, softly, her tone devoid of malice, yet brimming with quiet resolve. "I've done nothing wrong." Her words felt like an accusation, cutting deeper than she likely intended. Ryan's frustration boiled over, his response snapping like a taut wire under pressure. "Don't tell me how to do my job." The harshness in his voice echoed down the empty street, a futile attempt to reassert control over a situation that was quickly spiraling out of his hands. Margaret's gaze remained steady, her calm demeanor serving as an unspoken challenge to his authority. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable, yet her silence seemed to speak volumes. "Are you deaf?" Ryan barked, taking a step closer. "I said—" Before he could finish, Margaret's voice cut through his tirade like a scalpel. "Let go of me," she said firmly, as his hand clamped down on her arm. Her tone was calm, but carried an unmistakable edge of defiance. "I'm not afraid of you, Officer Steele." The use of his name struck him like a lightning bolt, momentarily halting his momentum. His grip faltered, the realization planting a seed of doubt in his mind. How did she know his name? Was she bluffing? Questions swirled in his head, but he quickly buried them under a renewed surge of anger. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Ryan growled, tightening his grip once more. His fingers pressed into the fabric of her coat, the physical contact a desperate attempt to regain the upper hand. "This isn't a game." Margaret's eyes didn't waver. "No, it isn't," she replied, her voice unyielding. "But your behavior is unacceptable." Her calmness and refusal to cower stoked the flames of Ryan's anger. He leaned in closer, his face mere inches from hers. "Do you know who you're talking to?" He spat, his voice low and dangerous. Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "Yes," she said simply, her tone steady. "An officer who has lost sight of his duty." Her words cut into his pride like a dagger, and Ryan felt the weight of her statement settle in his chest like a stone. Instead of introspection, he lashed out, his frustration boiling over. He yanked her arm roughly, causing her to stumble slightly. Margaret caught herself, her cane clattering to the ground as she steadied her balance. Her expression, however, didn't falter, nor did her resolve. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice as calm as ever. "And you're too blinded by your anger to see it." Ryan's vision blurred with rage. His grip on her arm tightened, his knuckles turning white under the strain. He opened his mouth to retort, but the words caught in his throat as Margaret did something unexpected. She smiled. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there, a ghost of amusement that danced on the edges of her lips. To Ryan, it felt like mockery, as if she saw through the brittle facade of his authority. Her smile only deepened his anger, feeding the fire that threatened to consume him. "You think this is funny?" he snarled, shaking her slightly. "Do you have any idea who you're messing with?" Margaret's smile faded, replaced by an expression of quiet determination. "Yes," she said again, her voice calm but firm. "Someone who doesn't deserve the badge he's wearing." Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for a moment, Ryan was at a loss. The accusation stung more than he wanted to admit, but he refused to let it show. Instead, he leaned into his anger, using it as a shield against the uncomfortable truth. "You're going to regret this," he hissed, his voice laced with venom. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her expression unchanging. "Neither do you," she said softly, her cryptic statement adding another layer of tension to the already volatile situation. Brian's mind raced as the seed of doubt she had planted began to take root. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Her calmness, her refusal to back down, and the way she seemed to know more than she was letting on. It all felt wrong. But his pride wouldn't allow him to admit it, not even to himself. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, faint but growing louder. Ryan's grip on Margaret's arm loosened slightly as his attention shifted toward the approaching figures. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street, casting long shadows across the pavement. Margaret seized the opportunity to pull her arm free, stepping back as the first federal agent rounded the corner. She straightened her coat, brushing off the fabric as if to erase the evidence of Ryan's aggression. But her eyes never left his, the intensity of her gaze unbroken. "You're done, Officer Steele," she said, her voice low but firm. "You just don't realize it yet." Ryan's stomach churned as the realization began to sink in. This wasn't just a confrontation, this was something much bigger, something he hadn't anticipated. He glanced at the approaching agents, their expressions grim and determined, and felt the first pangs of panic clawing at the edges of his composure. Margaret, meanwhile, remained steady, her demeanor unchanged despite the chaos unfolding around her. "You brought this on yourself," she said softly, her tone carrying an air of finality. "Now you'll face the consequences." Ryan's world tilted as the agents closed in, their voices a cacophony of commands and questions. For the first time, he felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him, suffocating and inescapable. As he locked eyes with Margaret's unwavering gaze, realization struck. She had been right all along. The game was over. The night air grew heavier, wrapping around Ryan's steel like a suffocating shroud. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the faint murmurs of the approaching agents. Margaret Hill stood her ground, her composure unshaken, despite the tension thick in the air. Her calm demeanor felt like defiance, a subtle, unspoken challenge to Ryan's authority. To him, it was unbearable. Every word she spoke, every measured movement she made, seemed calculated to provoke him. His grip tightened around his flashlight, the cold metal digging into his palm. The small seed of doubt she had planted earlier had grown, twisting through his thoughts. Yet his anger eclipsed everything else. He couldn't let her win. Not like this. "You think you're untouchable?" he growled, his voice low and venomous. "You think I'll just let you walk away from this?" Margaret's response was infuriatingly calm. "You're the one who's out of control, Officer Steele," she said, her voice carrying a steady authority that made his blood boil. "Take a step back before you do something you can't undo." But it was already too late. Ryan's vision blurred with rage, her words only fueling the fire inside him. He didn't think. He couldn't. His body moved before his mind could catch up, his fist swinging in a wide arc. The impact was brutal, his knuckles connecting with Margaret's jaw in a sickening thud. The sound echoed down the empty street, slicing through the silence like a gunshot. Margaret staggered, her cane clattering to the ground as she fell to one knee. The plastic grocery bag slipped from her hand, its contents spilling across the pavement. Bread, milk, and a tin of soup rolling into the gutter. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Ryan stood there, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched. The world around him blurred, the streetlights casting distorted shadows that danced like ghosts. Margaret didn't cry out or recoil in fear. Instead, she slowly raised her hand to her mouth, wiping away the blood trickling from her split lip. "You'll regret that, officer," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious pain. Her words were not a threat, but a promise, laced with the weight of unshakable certainty. Ryan's stomach twisted as the enormity of what he had just done began to sink in, but instead of retreating, he doubled down, his pride refusing to let him back away now. "Don't you dare threaten me," he spat, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "You think you can intimidate me?" Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she slowly reached into her coat pocket, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Ryan's instincts flared, his grip tightening on his flashlight as adrenaline surged through his veins. His mind raced, imagining the worst: a weapon, a recording device, something that could ruin him. "Stop!" he barked, his voice cracking under the pressure. "Don't move another inch." But Margaret didn't stop. Her hand emerged from her pocket, and what she held was far worse than anything Ryan could have anticipated. It wasn't a weapon, it wasn't even a phone. It was a badge. A gleaming FBI badge, its polished surface catching the flickering light of the street lamp. The sight of it hit Ryan like a freight train, freezing him in place. The badge gleamed with an authority that dwarfed his own, its presence rendering him powerless. Margaret rose slowly, dusting off her coat as she held the badge up for him to see. "Special Agent Margaret Hill," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "Undercover." Ryan's world tilted, his grip on the flashlight slackening as the weight of her words crashed down on him. He stared at her, unable to speak, his mind scrambling for an explanation, a justification, anything that could undo what had just happened. "Congratulations, Officer Steele," Margaret said, her tone colder than the winter air. "You've just made a career-ending mistake." The words hit like a hammer blow, shattering the fragile foundation of Ryan's authority. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The reality of the situation was undeniable, and there was no escape. The sirens, once distant, were now deafening, a grim herald of his impending downfall. Ryan stepped back, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. His mind raced, searching for a way to salvage the situation, but there was nothing. Margaret stood before him, her badge a shield against his anger, her presence a testament to his failure. "You set me up," he said finally, his voice weak and trembling. "This was all a setup." Margaret tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "No, officer," she replied. "You set yourself up. I just gave you the opportunity to show your true colors." The words stung, their truth cutting deeper than Ryan cared to admit. He felt the weight of her gaze, the judgment in her eyes burning into him. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but there was nothing he could say to change the outcome. The flashing red and blue lights cast eerie shadows across the pavement as the first federal agents arrived. They moved with purpose, their faces grim as they assessed the situation. Margaret turned to meet them, her posture straight and confident, despite the blood on her lip. "He assaulted me," she said simply, her voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced any doubts. "It's all on camera." Ryan's heart sank as her words registered. He glanced around frantically, his eyes searching for the camera she had mentioned. And then he saw it. A small device tucked into the corner of a nearby building, its lens aimed squarely at the street. Panic clawed at his chest as the agents closed in, their movements precise and methodical. Ryan raised his hands instinctively, his flashlight clattering to the ground as they approached. "This isn't fair," he sputtered, his voice cracking with desperation. "She provoked me. She..." Margaret didn't even glance at him as she addressed the agent. "Officer Steele has a history of misconduct," she said. "This was just the latest incident." Her words sealed his fate. Ryan felt the cold grip of handcuffs around his wrists, the metallic click echoing in his ears like a death knell. As he was led away, the weight of his actions bore down on him, crushing him under the inescapable reality of his failure. Margaret watched him go, her expression unreadable. The night was far from over, and the battle against the corruption he represented had only just begun. The wail of sirens grew louder, an ominous chorus that mirrored Ryan Steele's spiraling panic. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the darkness, illuminating the street in rhythmic bursts. Ryan stood frozen, his breathing shallow, as he watched the federal vehicles screech to a halt nearby. The heavy doors swung open, and agents emerged with an air of purpose and authority, their dark uniforms contrasting sharply with the chaos that had just unfolded. Margaret Hill didn't flinch as the agents approached. Blood still trickled from the corner of her lip, but she remained steady, her posture unyielding. The gleaming badge in her hand was explanation enough for the scene before them, but Margaret's voice cut through the tension with quiet precision. "He attacked me unprovoked," she said, her tone calm yet commanding. "It's all on camera." Her words were like a gavel slamming down in court, definitive and irrefutable. Ryan's chest tightened as he watched the agents glance from her to him, their expressions hardening with grim determination. One of them stepped forward, his hand already reaching for the cuffs clipped to his belt. Ryan's instincts kicked in, and he took a half step back, his hands raised defensively. "Wait," he sputtered, his voice cracking. "This isn't what it looks like. I didn't know she was FBI." The agents didn't pause. The leader, a tall man with a sharp jawline, motioned for his team to proceed. "Cuff him," he said curtly, his voice leaving no room for argument. No, you don't understand," Ryan pleaded, his words tumbling over each other in desperation. "She provoked me. She was baiting me. This isn't fair." Margaret's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, her calm facade cracked, revealing a flash of anger. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a steely edge. "Fair?" she repeated, her tone cold and unforgiving. "You've been abusing your authority for years. Now it's your turn to face justice." Ryan flinched at her words, but his desperation overpowered his shame. "It was a mistake," he shouted, his voice rising with panic as the cold metal of the cuffs bit into his wrists. "I didn't mean for it to happen. She was acting suspicious. I was just doing my job." Margaret didn't waver. "Your job," she said, her voice slicing through his protests like a blade. "Your job was to serve and protect, not to bully and assault. But you crossed the line, Officer Steele, and now you'll answer for it." The agents pulled Ryan's arms behind his back, their movements efficient and impersonal. He struggled against their grip, but it was futile. The cuffs clicked into place with a finality that sent a chill down his spine. The leader of the agents turned to Margaret, his expression tinged with professional concern. "Are you all right, Agent Hill?" he asked, his eyes flicking briefly to the blood on her lip. Margaret nodded, brushing off his concern with a slight wave of her hand. "I'm fine," she said firmly. "Focus on him. He's the one we've been tracking." The words hit Ryan like a punch to the gut. "Tracking?" he echoed, his voice trembling with disbelief. "What are you talking about? I'm not some criminal." Margaret's gaze bore into him, unrelenting. "No," she said evenly, "you're worse. You've been hiding behind your badge, using it as a weapon against the very people you were supposed to protect. And tonight, you showed your true colors." Ryan shook his head, his mind reeling. "This is insane," he muttered. "You set me up. This whole thing was a setup." Margaret arched an eyebrow, her expression cool and detached. "You gave me all the evidence I needed," she said simply. "I didn't set you up, Officer Steele. You set yourself up." The agents began leading Ryan toward one of their vehicles, his protests growing more frantic with every step. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his panic. "You can't just ruin my life over one mistake." Margaret followed them, her steps measured and deliberate. She stopped just short of the vehicle, her gaze fixed on Ryan as he was forced into the back seat. "This isn't just about tonight," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "It's about every time you abused your power, every person you intimidated, every line you crossed. This is justice, Officer Steele, and it's long overdue." Ryan slumped against the seat, his breathing shallow as the gravity of his situation finally settled over him. The door slammed shut, cutting off his view of Margaret and the agents outside. Inside the vehicle, the cold, sterile air seemed to suffocate him, amplifying his sense of helplessness. Outside, Margaret turned back to the lead agent. "I want a full report," she said, her tone crisp and professional. "Every detail needs to be documented." The agent nodded. "Understood, we'll handle it." Margaret allowed herself a brief moment to exhale, the weight of the night pressing down on her, but there was no time for rest. The arrest of Ryan Steele was just the beginning. The network of corruption within the department ran deeper than him, and Margaret knew that tonight's events would send shockwaves through the system. As the federal vehicles pulled away, their sirens fading into the distance, Margaret stood alone on the empty street. She glanced down at the scattered groceries, the bread crushed and the tin of soup dented from its tumble into the gutter. It was a small detail, insignificant in the grand scheme of what had just transpired, but it lingered in her mind, a reminder of the human cost of corruption and abuse. With a sigh, she pulled out her phone and dialed her supervisor. The line clicked after a few rings and a familiar voice greeted her. "Agent Hill," the voice said, "I trust the situation has been handled?" Margaret's gaze drifted back to the street lamp, its light still flickering erratically. "Steele's in custody," she said, her tone neutral. "But this isn't over. The deeper we dig, the worse it gets." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Understood," her supervisor said finally. "We'll need a full debrief first thing in the morning." Margaret nodded, even though no one could see her. "I'll be there," she said, ending the call. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and turned away from the scene, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. The road ahead was long, but Margaret was ready to face it. Justice had been served tonight, but there was still much work to be done. By the following morning, the city was buzzing with the news of Officer Ryan Steele's arrest. It began as a ripple, whispers in community forums and posts on social media, but within hours it grew into a roaring tidal wave. Headlines plastered across major news outlets carried variations of the same explosive story. Local officer arrested after assaulting FBI agent in undercover operation. The accompanying footage, leaked from the street camera, showed the moment Ryan struck Margaret, followed by the reveal of her FBI badge. It was a damning visual, one that spread like wildfire. The public outrage was immediate and visceral. The community, long simmering with frustration over allegations of police misconduct, found in this incident a flashpoint for their anger. Comment sections and social media platforms erupted with demands for accountability, not just for Ryan Steele, but for the entire precinct. Hashtags like Defend Margaret and hashtag End Police Brutality trended nationwide, drawing attention far beyond the city's borders. By mid-afternoon, the precinct was surrounded by protesters. They came armed not with weapons, but with signs and voices. Placards bearing slogans such as "Justice for Margaret" and "No More Rogue Cops" bobbed above the growing crowd. The chants began as a steady rhythm. What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now! The crowd swelled with each passing hour, an undeniable testament to the community's pent-up frustration. Local activists took the opportunity to speak out, amplifying stories of others who had suffered under the weight of unchecked authority. Ryan's past actions were dragged into the spotlight. Old complaints, previously buried under bureaucratic red tape, resurfaced. Video clips of him intimidating civilians, reports of excessive force, and allegations of racial profiling painted a damning picture. He wasn't just a bad cop, he was a symptom of a larger, systemic issue. The chants grew louder. Justice for Margaret evolved into End Police Brutality as more people joined the protest. Families with children, college students, and retirees stood shoulder to shoulder, unified by a shared sense of injustice. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officers peered through the blinds, watching the growing crowd with a mixture of unease and resentment. Many of them had known Ryan for years, and while some harbored doubts about him, others felt betrayed by the media's portrayal of their colleague. "What the hell's going on out there?" one officer muttered, pacing back and forth. "It's a circus," another replied, shaking his head. "They're acting like we're all criminals because of Steele." The tension wasn't confined to the protesters and the police. Reporters swarmed the scene, their cameras capturing every moment. Questions were shouted at officers entering or exiting the building. "Do you condone Officer Steele's actions? Is this department complicit in covering up misconduct? Are more arrests coming?" The police chief, a man whose face was quickly becoming a familiar sight on television, stepped out to address the media. His expression was grim, and his words were measured. "We do not condone the actions of Officer Ryan Steele," he began, his voice carrying over the din of the crowd. "The incident involving Special Agent Hill is under investigation, and we are fully cooperating with federal authorities. Our department is committed to transparency and accountability." But his words rang hollow for many. For years, the precinct had been accused of sweeping complaints under the rug, shielding officers like Ryan from consequences. The protesters weren't just angry about Margaret Hill. They were angry about everything she represented: the misuse of power, the abuse of trust, and the lack of accountability. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the protest showed no signs of slowing. If anything, the crowd seemed to grow more impassioned. Fires burned in trash cans along the sidewalks, their flickering light casting eerie shadows on the faces of the demonstrators. A group of young activists took turns with a megaphone, sharing stories of their own encounters with law enforcement. Each tale added fuel to the fire of indignation. The chants grew sharper, more personal. "Who protects us from you?" echoed through the streets. Meanwhile, a line of riot police formed just inside the precinct gate, their shields and batons a silent warning. The tension was palpable, with each side watching the other warily. The faintest spark, it seemed, could ignite chaos. From a distance, Margaret watched the scene unfold. Standing in an unmarked car parked a block away, she listened to the chants and studied the faces in the crowd. She had been advised to stay out of the public eye, but she couldn't stay away entirely. This wasn't just about her. It was about a community fighting back. "Do you think this will lead to real change?" an agent beside her asked, breaking the silence. Margaret didn't respond immediately. Her gaze lingered on a young boy holding a sign that read, "My dad was arrested for nothing." "It depends," she said finally, her tone measured. "Anger is powerful, but only if it's directed at the right targets. This can't just be about Ryan Steele. It has to be about the system that let him get away with it for so long." As the night wore on, the situation grew increasingly volatile. A group of protesters broke through the barricades, their frustration spilling over into fury. They pounded on the gates of the precinct, their voices rising into a crescendo of rage. The line of riot police advanced, shields raised, a silent demand for order. "Stay back," one officer barked through a megaphone. "This is an unlawful assembly. Disperse immediately." But the crowd didn't move. Instead, they shouted louder, their voices a unified roar. "No justice, no peace. No racist police." In the chaos, a protester hurled a water bottle. The plastic container bounced harmlessly off a shield, but it was enough to trigger a response. The riot police surged forward, batons raised, and the crowd erupted in a flurry of movement. Margaret's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen, a text from her supervisor. "You need to speak at the press conference tomorrow. The public needs to hear from you." She sighed, sliding the phone back into her coat pocket. The work ahead was daunting, but she knew it was necessary. The voices of the protesters weren't just angry, they were desperate. Margaret understood that desperation. It was the same drive that had led her to join the FBI in the first place. The belief that justice, no matter how delayed, was worth fighting for. By the time the first rays of dawn broke over the city, the protest had transformed from an outcry against Ryan Steele into a movement. Organizers worked to channel the energy of the crowd into actionable demands: independent oversight of the police department, improved training programs, and stricter accountability measures. Margaret watched from a distance, her resolve hardening. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles. But as she listened to the chants echoing through the streets, she felt a flicker of hope. Change was coming, and this time, it wouldn't be ignored. The days following Ryan Steele's arrest were a whirlwind of activity at the FBI's local headquarters. Margaret Hill, still nursing the bruise on her lip from her confrontation with Steele, sat at the head of a conference table, her presence commanding the room. Around her, agents sifted through a mountain of documents, photographs, and digital records, each piece of evidence adding to the growing picture of systemic corruption within the police department. Margaret adjusted her glasses and leaned forward, her voice steady and firm. "We've confirmed what we suspected. Steele isn't the anomaly he wants us to believe. He's part of a larger pattern, and at the center of it is Lieutenant Greg Hanine." The agents exchanged grim looks. Hanine's name wasn't new to them. Whispers of his involvement in questionable activities had circulated for years, but no solid evidence had ever surfaced. Until now. The investigation had started with Steele, but as agents combed through his personnel file, irregularities emerged. Complaints of excessive force and misconduct were present, but many were mysteriously marked as resolved, with no explanation. The names of officers who had signed off on these resolutions appeared repeatedly, and one name stood out more than any other: Greg Hannon. Margaret's team dug deeper. They cross-referenced old reports, internal emails, and financial records. What they uncovered painted a damning picture. "This isn't just a few bad cops," Margaret explained during the next briefing, her tone grave. "This is a coordinated effort to protect officers who should have been held accountable. Hanine's been shielding them, burying complaints, and falsifying reports to keep them on the streets." She clicked a button on the laptop in front of her, and the projector screen lit up with a web of connections. Names, dates, and incidents, all tied to Hanine. In one corner of the chart was Ryan Steele, but his face was just one among many. With each passing day, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Bank records revealed suspicious payments to Hanine from anonymous accounts, transactions that coincided with key dates in Steele's career. In one instance, a large deposit appeared just days after Steele was cleared of a misconduct charge involving the wrongful arrest of a teenager. The teenager's family had filed a formal complaint, but it had been quietly dismissed by Hanine. "These payouts are hush money," Margaret said during another briefing. And not just for Steele, we've identified at least 4 other officers with similar patterns, complaints that vanish, charges that disappear, and careers that flourish under Haneen's protection. Agents had also discovered that Haneen had fostered a culture of fear within the department. Whistleblowers were silenced, often through threats or reassignment to undesirable posts. Meanwhile, those who played along with Haneen's schemes found themselves fast-tracked for promotions. "This goes deeper than we thought," Margaret admitted to her team, her expression somber. "Steele's just the tip of the iceberg. Haneen is the real target." The breakthrough came when a junior agent stumbled upon an old storage unit rented under a fake name. Inside were boxes of documents, physical evidence that Haneen had kept as leverage. Margaret and her team spent hours combing through the files, their contents both shocking and damning. One file contained falsified incident reports, doctored to absolve officers of wrongdoing. Another held recordings of phone calls in which Haneen could be heard instructing officers on how to manipulate evidence. But the most incriminating was a handwritten ledger detailing payments Haneen had received from various sources, along with notes about the services he provided in return. Margaret stared at the ledger in disbelief. "This is it," she said quietly. "This is what we need to bring him down." Back at headquarters, the mood was tense but determined. Margaret's team worked tirelessly to organize the evidence into a comprehensive case against Haneen. The goal wasn't just to arrest him, it was to dismantle the entire network he had built. Margaret stood before her team during a late-night meeting, her voice resolute. "Haneen's arrest won't fix the department overnight," she said, "but it's a start. If we can show the public that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it, we can begin to rebuild trust." One of her agents raised a hand. "What about the officers under Haneen? Are we going after them too?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, but Haneen is the priority. Without him, the network collapses. Once we have him in custody, we'll roll up the rest." News of the FBI's investigation had already begun to leak into the public sphere, thanks to speculative reporting. Protesters outside the precinct chanted louder, their signs bearing slogans like "Clean House" and "Haneen must go." Inside the precinct, paranoia reigned. Officers who had once walked confidently now avoided eye contact, fearful that their names might appear in the FBI's findings. Haneen, however, remained outwardly calm, a veteran of internal investigations who had weathered storms before. But Margaret knew better. "He's nervous," she told her team after reviewing footage of Haneen during a recent press conference. "He's trying to act unbothered, but the cracks are showing. He knows we're coming." As the FBI prepared for the next phase of their operation, Margaret gathered her team for one final briefing. The evidence was ironclad, but the stakes were high. Haneen had powerful connections, and there was no telling how far he'd go to protect himself. Margaret addressed the room, her voice steady but intense. "We've uncovered a lot, but we can't underestimate him. Haneen has spent years building this network, and he's not going to give it up without a fight. Stay sharp and stay focused." The agents nodded, their determination palpable. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they also knew that their work could make a difference, not just for Margaret, but for every victim of the corruption they were fighting to expose. Margaret lingered in the conference room after the meeting ended, her eyes scanning the evidence board one last time. The faces of the officers tied to Haneen stared back at her, each one a reminder of the work still to be done. But at the center of it all was Haneen himself, his face circled in red ink, a symbol of the system they were determined to dismantle. Taking a deep breath, Margaret steeled herself for the next steps. The fight wasn't over yet, but she was ready. Justice, she knew, was rarely swift or easy, but it was always worth pursuing. The cell was cold and unrelenting, its gray walls closing in on Ryan Steele with every passing hour. He sat on the edge of the narrow cot, his head in his hands, the weight of his situation pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. The sound of a distant door clanging shut reverberated through the facility, each echo a grim reminder of his isolation. Ryan's thoughts churned, a chaotic blend of fear, anger, and self-pity. The image of Margaret Hill's calm, unyielding face haunted him, her words cutting deeper than any reprimand he had ever received. "You've been abusing your authority for years. Now it's your turn to face justice." The memory replayed in his mind, each repetition fueling his growing dread. He had been so sure of his power, so certain that his badge protected him. Now, stripped of his authority, he felt naked and vulnerable, a man exposed for all his flaws. Hours bled into one another, the monotony of his cell broken only by the occasional footsteps of guards passing by. Ryan's mind spiraled as he contemplated his future. The media frenzy, the protests, the growing list of accusations. It was all too much. His reputation was ruined, his career destroyed. The system he had relied on for protection now seemed eager to sacrifice him to save itself. A sharp knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as the door swung open. Standing there, composed and resolute, was Margaret Hill. Her presence filled the small space, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Ryan's frayed nerves. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with quiet finality. "Steele," she said, her voice steady but firm, "we need to talk." Ryan glared at her, his jaw tightening. "What's there to talk about?" he muttered. "You've already ruined my life." Margaret didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat across from him, her gaze unwavering. "Your life isn't ruined," she said. "Not yet. But it will be if you keep playing the victim." Ryan scoffed, leaning back against the cold wall. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one locked up, with everyone calling you a monster." Margaret tilted her head slightly, her expression softening just enough to convey a sliver of understanding. "You made choices, Steele, and those choices have consequences, but you still have a chance to make this right." Ryan frowned, his defenses rising instinctively. "What are you talking about?" Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Haneen, we know he's the one who's been pulling the strings, protecting officers like you, burying complaints, falsifying reports. We have evidence, but we need more. We need you to cooperate." Ryan's stomach twisted at the mention of Haneen's name. He had known the lieutenant for years, had benefited from his protection more times than he cared to admit. But he also knew what Haneen was capable of. The man wasn't just a corrupt officer. He was dangerous. Ryan shook his head, his voice trembling. "I can't," he said. "You don't understand. Haneen, he's not just some dirty cop. He has connections. If I talk, he'll kill me." Margaret's expression hardened. "If you stay silent, he'll hang you out to dry. Do you really think Haneen will stick his neck out for you now? You're a liability, Steele. The only way you survive this is by helping us take him down." Ryan's breathing quickened, his panic palpable. "You don't get it," he said, his voice rising. "Haneen doesn't leave loose ends. If I talk, I'm dead. He'll find a way. He always does." Margaret studied him for a moment, her silence heavy with meaning. When she finally spoke, her tone was measured but firm. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this, Steele. You're in a bad spot, but sitting here, wallowing in fear, isn't going to save you. The only way out is forward." Ryan's mind raced as he weighed his options. On one hand, he knew Margaret was right. Haneen wouldn't hesitate to throw him under the bus if it meant saving himself. On the other hand, the thought of betraying Haneen filled him with a deep, paralyzing dread. The man's influence was far-reaching, his power extending well beyond the precinct. Margaret saw the conflict in his eyes and pressed on. "You're not the first person Haneen has used," she said, "and you won't be the last. If you don't help us, he'll keep doing what he's been doing, ruining lives, destroying communities, and undermining the very system he's supposed to uphold. Do you really want to be a part of that?" Ryan hesitated, his defenses cracking under the weight of her words. He thought about the protests outside, the chants calling for justice, the faces of the people he had wronged. For the first time, he felt the sting of shame, not just for himself, but for the role he had played in perpetuating the corruption that had brought him to this point. Margaret leaned back slightly, giving him space to process. She knew this was a delicate moment, one that could determine the course of the entire investigation. "This is your chance, Steele," she said finally. "Your chance to do something good, to prove that you're more than just a corrupt cop. But you have to make the choice." Ryan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He glanced at her, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and desperation. "If I talk," he said slowly, "how do I know you'll keep me safe?" Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "We'll protect you," she said firmly. "You have my word, but you need to give us something we can use." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Ryan's mind churned as he considered the enormity of what she was asking. To betray Haneen was to invite danger, but to stay silent was to seal his own fate. Finally, he exhaled, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded, standing and straightening her coat. "Don't take too long," she said. "Time isn't on your side." She turned to leave, her footsteps echoing softly as she exited the cell. Ryan watched her go, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear, anger, and uncertainty. He was trapped, caught between the man he had been and the man he could become. And as the door clanged shut behind her, he realized that the choice was his, alone, to make. The air in the FBI headquarters was tense as the clock ticked past midnight. Margaret Hill sat at her desk, poring over the latest files from the investigation. She couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest since her visit to Ryan Steele's cell. His trembling voice and haunted eyes weren't the looks of a man resigned to his fate. They were the looks of a man trapped in fear, weighing his options. Her phone buzzed, the shrill tone breaking the stillness of the room. She grabbed it instinctively, her heart skipping a beat at the sight of the caller ID. It was the detention center. "Agent Hill?" she answered, her tone sharp. "Ma'am," the voice on the other end began, hesitant. "There's been an incident. Steele's dead. Apparent suicide." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, the air around her thickening. "No," she muttered under her breath, her grip tightening on the phone. "That doesn't make sense." The guard continued nervously, oblivious to her growing tension. "We found him hanging in his cell about 20 minutes ago. The scene looks clean. The medical team is calling it self-inflicted." Margaret's mind raced. Ryan Steele might have been many things. Arrogant, corrupt, and morally bankrupt. But suicidal wasn't one of them. During their conversation earlier, he'd been scared, yes, but also clinging to the hope of survival. He was considering her offer. "This wasn't an accident," she muttered to herself, her jaw tightening. "Haneen's cleaning house." Margaret arrived at the detention center within the hour, striding through its sterile halls with grim determination. A guard escorted her to Ryan's cell, though she hardly needed the directions. The growing sense of dread in her chest pulled her forward, like a compass pointing north. When she stepped into the cell, the scene was eerily tidy. Ryan's body had already been removed, but the noose, a crudely fashioned strip of his bedsheet, still dangled from the ceiling. The small cot, the overturned stool, the lifeless air of the room, it all screamed suicide. Yet Margaret's keen eyes caught the inconsistencies. The stool was positioned too neatly beneath where Ryan's body had been hanging, as though someone had placed it there deliberately. The bedsheet rope showed signs of being tied hastily, but with an efficiency that didn't match the desperation of a man in despair. And then there was the complete lack of struggle. No scratches on the walls, no signs of resistance. Ryan had been terrified, yes, but he had also been a fighter. This wasn't how he would have gone down. Margaret turned to the guard stationed at the door. "Who found him?" she asked sharply. "Officer Tran, during the midnight rounds," the guard replied. "She said everything seemed normal during the previous check." Margaret narrowed her eyes. Who had access to this area between those checks? The guard shifted uncomfortably. "Technically, only authorized personnel, but you know how it is. Sometimes doors are left open longer than they should be." Margaret's expression darkened. Convenient, she thought. Too convenient. She stepped outside the cell, pulling out her phone and dialing her supervisor, Harris. The line connected on the second ring. "Margaret," Harris greeted, his voice laced with concern. "What's going on?" "Steele's dead," she said bluntly, wasting no time on pleasantries. "They're calling it a suicide, but it's staged. Haneen's desperate. He's tying up loose ends." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Harris responded. "Are you sure? If this gets out—" "I'm sure," Margaret interrupted. "Steele was scared, yes, but he wasn't suicidal. And the way this scene was set up, it's too clean. This was a hit, Harris. Haneen's cleaning house, and we need to move before he gets to anyone else." Harris sighed heavily, the weight of the situation settling over them both. "What's your next move?" Margaret's mind was already racing through possibilities. "We need to lock down the rest of our witnesses and suspects, anyone who might be on Hannon's radar. And we need to accelerate the timeline on the raid. If we wait any longer, we'll lose our window." "I'll authorize it," Harris said. "But Margaret, be careful. If Haneen's this desperate, he won't hesitate to come after you." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Let him try," she said quietly, ending the call. As Margaret exited the detention center, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was one of her junior agents, Jenkins, sounding breathless. "Agent Hill, we found something," he said, urgency lacing his voice. "It's about Haneen. You're going to want to see this." Margaret drove to headquarters in record time, her thoughts swirling as she tried to piece together the fragments of the puzzle. When she arrived, Jenkins was waiting for her in the briefing room, a laptop open in front of him. "What is it?" Margaret asked, her tone clipped. Jenkins turned the laptop toward her, revealing a series of emails retrieved from Haneen's personal account. The emails were coded, but the intent was clear. Haneen had been orchestrating payouts to silence potential threats, including Ryan. One email in particular caught Margaret's attention. It was dated the night before Ryan's death and contained a chilling message. "Ensure the problem is handled. No loose ends." Margaret's blood ran cold. "He ordered it," she said quietly, more to herself than to Jenkins. "He ordered Steele's murder." The revelation solidified Margaret's resolve. She called her team into an emergency meeting, laying out the evidence they had gathered. The plan was simple but risky. They would move on Haneen immediately, executing coordinated raids on his office and home to secure the remaining evidence. "This is our chance to stop him," Margaret said, her voice firm as she addressed the room. "Haneen thinks he can operate above the law, but tonight we remind him that no one is untouchable." The agents nodded, their determination mirroring her own. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had the potential reward. If they succeeded, they wouldn't just take down Haneen, they would dismantle the entire corrupt network he had built. As the team prepared for the raid, Margaret allowed herself a brief moment of introspection. Ryan Steele's death weighed heavily on her, not because she believed he was innocent, but because he had been a victim of the very system he had perpetuated. In another life, perhaps he could have made different choices, taken a different path. But now, he was gone, a casualty in a battle for justice that was far from over. "This wasn't an accident," she murmured to herself, her gaze hardening. "But it won't be in vain." With that, she rose to her feet, ready to lead her team into the next phase of the fight. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but Margaret Hill was no stranger to difficult paths. Justice demanded it, and she was determined to see it through. The night was heavy with tension as Margaret Hill stood outside the precinct, her breath visible in the cold air. Around her, the FBI agents moved with quiet precision, their faces set with determination. This was the moment they had been preparing for, the culmination of weeks of investigation and countless hours of work. Inside the precinct walls, Lieutenant Greg Henin carried on as if he were untouchable, oblivious to the storm about to descend. Margaret glanced at her watch, then at her team. "Everyone knows their assignments," she said firmly. "We move quickly, secure everything, and leave no room for error. Henin is dangerous, but tonight, we take him down." The agents nodded in unison, their resolve evident. With a curt nod, Margaret gave the signal. "Let's move!" The raid began with swift precision. Doors were flung open, and FBI agents streamed into the precinct, their presence impossible to ignore. The officers inside froze in surprise, their conversations and movements abruptly halted. The air filled with the sound of boots on tile, the clatter of equipment, and the sharp commands of agents securing the area. Margaret led the charge toward Henin's office, her steps measured yet purposeful. Each corridor she passed felt like a gauntlet lined with wary officers. Some looked confused, others hostile, but none dared interfere. They knew better than to cross federal agents during an operation. Reaching Henin's office, Margaret paused for a brief moment. Behind the closed door was the man at the center of the corruption she had spent weeks uncovering. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Henin was seated at his desk, the picture of calm authority. He barely looked up as Margaret and the agents entered, his demeanor cool and collected. But Margaret saw through the facade. Beneath the composed exterior, subtle signs of unease betrayed him, the faint twitch of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. "What's the meaning of this?" Henin demanded, his voice steady but edged with irritation. "You can't just barge in here like this." Margaret stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "Lieutenant Greg Henin," she began, her voice sharp and clear, "you're under investigation for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and multiple counts of corruption. We have a warrant to search your office and seize any evidence related to your activities." Henin leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You've got nothing on me," he scoffed. "This is a desperate attempt to smear my name." Margaret didn't flinch. She placed a folder on his desk and opened it, revealing the evidence they had collected. "This," she said, her tone firm, "is everything we need to take you down. Financial records, falsified reports, and communications tying you to illegal activities. Your reign is over." As Margaret confronted Henin, agents moved swiftly through the office, searching for additional evidence. Filing cabinets were opened, drawers emptied, and computer files copied. Every item was meticulously cataloged and secured, adding to the growing case against him. Henin's smirk faltered as more incriminating material came to light. A ledger hidden in a desk drawer, a flash drive containing sensitive communications, even a stash of cash tucked away in a safe. Each discovery chipped away at his confidence, leaving him visibly rattled. "You're making a mistake," Henin said, his tone shifting to one of desperation. "This is all a misunderstanding." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding? Like the payouts you received to cover up misconduct? Or the threats you made to silence whistleblowers? Face it, Henin, you've been caught." The tension in the room reached its peak as an agent approached Margaret, handing her a pair of handcuffs. She turned to Henin, her expression cold and unyielding. "Lieutenant Greg Henin," she said, her voice steady, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent." Henin stood reluctantly, his movements stiff. For a moment, it seemed as though he might resist, but the presence of armed agents left him no choice. Margaret stepped forward, securing the cuffs around his wrists with practiced ease. "You're making a big mistake," Henin muttered, his voice low and threatening. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Margaret met his gaze, her own unwavering. "Neither do you," she replied, "but you're about to find out." As Henin was led out of the office, Margaret allowed herself a brief moment to take in the scene. The once imposing figure of Henin, now in handcuffs, served as a stark reminder of the power of accountability. Agents continued their work, ensuring that no stone was left unturned and no detail overlooked. Margaret's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was her supervisor, Harris. She stepped into the hallway to take the call. "Hill," Harris said, his voice calm but firm. "How's it going?" "Hanan's in custody," Margaret replied. "And we found more evidence than we anticipated. This is bigger than we thought." Harris paused. "Good work. But be careful. If Hanin is as connected as we suspect, this might only be the beginning." Margaret nodded, her resolve hardening. "I know," she said, "but we'll be ready." The raid concluded in the early hours of the morning, leaving the precinct in disarray. Officers milled about, their faces a mix of confusion and apprehension. Hanin's arrest had sent shockwaves through the department, shaking the very foundation of its power structure. Margaret stood outside, watching as Hanin was loaded into the back of a federal vehicle. The protests outside the precinct had swelled during the raid, the crowd chanting louder than ever. As the car pulled away, the sound of their voices filled the air. "Justice for Margaret! End police corruption!" Margaret allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. This was just one battle in a much larger war, but it was a victory nonetheless. For the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but one thing was clear: the system was finally beginning to crack. Margaret Hill would stop at nothing to ensure those cracks widened, letting justice shine through. The raid on Hanin's office had been swift, but the work was far from over. Margaret stood amidst the chaos, her eyes scanning the room as agents cataloged files, computers, and any items that could hold incriminating evidence. Hanin, now in federal custody, had maintained his cool facade until the cuffs clicked around his wrists. Yet Margaret knew the real battle lay in the details, finding the piece of evidence that could dismantle his entire network. As she rifled through the contents of Hanin's desk, frustration simmered just beneath her composed exterior. Drawers were emptied, their mundane contents spilling onto the floor. Staplers, pens, folders labeled with innocuous department jargon. Nothing stood out, and time was running short. Margaret knew Hanin's network was vast, and his reach extended far beyond this office. She needed something concrete, something irrefutable. One of the agents called out from across the room, holding up a small key. "Found this in the bottom drawer, Agent Hill. Could be for the safe." Margaret's attention snapped to the agent. "Good work," she said briskly, taking the key and turning toward a nondescript cabinet tucked in the corner. It was an old safe, the kind that blended into the background and was easily overlooked. Margaret knelt, inserted the key, and twisted. The lock gave with a satisfying click. As the heavy door swung open, Margaret's breath caught. Inside were stacks of cash bundled tightly with rubber bands, several flash drives, and a single leather-bound notebook. The notebook stood out, its worn cover hinting at years of use. Margaret reached for it, her gloved hands steady but tense. She flipped open the cover and immediately recognized the significance of what she was holding. The pages were filled with meticulous records, dates, names, amounts, all written in Hanin's precise handwriting. It was a ledger, detailing every bribe, payout, and illicit transaction tied to his operation. The evidence was overwhelming, a damning testament to the corruption he had orchestrated. Margaret's heart raced as she skimmed the pages. Each entry painted a clearer picture of Hanin's reach. Officers paid to overlook crimes, witnesses silenced with hush money, and high-ranking officials complicit in maintaining the status quo. "This is it," she whispered to herself. "This is the smoking gun." Margaret called over Jenkins, one of the junior agents she trusted most. "Jenkins, start cross-referencing these names and dates with the reports we've pulled. I want to know exactly how deep this goes." Jenkins nodded, his face pale as he scanned the first few entries. This is bigger than we thought," he muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "These payments connect to cases we flagged as suspicious over the past decade." Margaret pressed her lips into a thin line. "Then we need to act fast. If this ledger gets out, it could unravel everything Haneen has built. As Jenkins began his work, Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed her supervisor, Harris. The line connected after the second ring. Hill Harris greeted, his tone brisk. "What's the situation?" Margaret didn't waste time. "We've found it," she said, gripping the ledger tightly in one hand as if it might vanish. A ledger. It documents everything. Bribes, payouts, even names of officers on his payroll. This notebook exposes it all. Haneen's finished. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Harris responded, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. "This is the break we needed." "Are you sure it's authentic?" "Positive," Margaret replied. "It's in his handwriting, and the entries match the patterns we've been tracking. This isn't just evidence, it's a roadmap to dismantling his entire operation." "Good work," Harris said. "Get it secured immediately. I'll start setting up the next phase with the legal team. We'll need to move quickly to maximize the impact." Margaret nodded, though Harris couldn't see her. "Understood. I'll personally oversee the transfer." She turned her attention back to the room, issuing orders with practiced efficiency. "This ledger is the priority," she told the team. "It goes straight to evidence lockup. No detours, no risks." Jenkins, now deep into the ledger's contents, looked up with a grim expression. "There's more here than we thought," he said, holding up another page. "This connects Haneen to city officials, private contractors, even a couple of judges. It's not just the department, it's the whole system." Margaret's stomach churned at the implications, but she didn't let it show. "That's why we need to move carefully," she said. "Haneen's network doesn't end with him. We're dealing with something much larger." Meanwhile, in federal custody, Haneen sat in an interrogation room, his usual composure beginning to crack. News of the raid's findings had reached him, and he knew the ledger was gone. When an agent informed him of Margaret's discovery, his mask of indifference slipped. "You think that notebook means anything?" he sneered, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "You can't prove half of what's in there." The agent leaned in, his tone calm but firm. "We don't need to. Your handwriting, your accounts, your signature, it's all there. You're finished." Haneen leaned back, his jaw tightening as the reality of his situation settled over him. For the first time, the man who had wielded so much power seemed truly cornered. Back at headquarters, Margaret worked with her team late into the night, piecing together the full scope of Haneen's corruption. The ledger provided connections to cases that had gone unsolved, complaints that had mysteriously disappeared, and individuals who had paid the ultimate price for standing in his way. Margaret stood before the evidence board, her eyes scanning the web of connections they had constructed. Each string led back to Haneen, his name at the center like a spider in its web. "This is bigger than any of us imagined," Jenkins said, his voice hushed. "How did he get away with it for so long?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on Haneen's photo pinned to the board. "Because no one was looking hard enough," she said finally. "Until now." As dawn approached, Margaret allowed herself a moment of reflection. The ledger was more than just a piece of evidence. It symbolized everything they had been fighting for. With it, they had the power to bring justice, not just to Haneen, but to everyone who had suffered under his corruption. "This is the beginning of the end," she muttered to herself, her resolve hardening. "For Haneen, and for anyone who thinks they're above the law." The road ahead was still fraught with challenges, but Margaret knew one thing for certain: they had the smoking gun. And now, it was only a matter of time before justice prevailed. When strong enough intelligence was pressured from all more secure discussions, recall amazing achievements, also recognizing the reason for many discussions in simmering unrest because of the precinct kinds of interaction had led to this moment. Margaret Hill stood near the main entrance as Weech reported. Being alone, Margaret Hill stood near the main entrance on the scribed precinct, happy to report us on that moment. The reason for being such a great intention on simmering unrest. Haneen's transfer from the holding cell to the transport van was meant to be quick and uneventful, but Margaret knew better. This wasn't just an arrest, it was a public reckoning, and the community was watching closely. The door to the precinct swung open, and the clamor of the crowd outside surged like a tidal wave. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the protesters' chants grew louder as Haneen emerged, flanked by 2 FBI agents. His wrists were bound by handcuffs, the shiny metal stark against his dark suit. Haneen's face was a mask of defiance. He walked with his chin raised, his demeanor carefully curated to project confidence, but a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed his discomfort. His eyes scanned the crowd, flickering with something that looked like contempt, or perhaps fear. Reporters swarmed forward, microphones jostling for position as they fired a barrage of questions. Lieutenant Haneen, do you have any comment on your arrest? Did you orchestrate the corruption in the department? Do you deny the allegations against you? Haneen didn't respond, his silence only fueling the frenzy. Margaret followed closely behind, her expression stoic but resolute. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. This was as much about holding Haneen accountable as it was about restoring the community's trust. Outside the precinct gates, the protesters erupted in cheers as Haneen was escorted toward the waiting van. Signs waved high above the crowd, bearing slogans like "Justice served" and "No more corruption." The chants shifted, uniting into a single refrain. Justice for all, justice for all. But beneath the celebration, Margaret could feel the undercurrent of unease. The community's anger wasn't just about Haneen, it was about the years of systemic failure he represented. For many, his arrest was a victory, but it was also a reminder of the long road ahead. As Haneen reached the van, he paused, turning slightly to face Margaret. His smirk returned, brittle but deliberate. "You think this changes anything?" he sneered. "You're fooling yourself. If you think taking me down will fix the system." Margaret met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "Maybe not," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "But it's a start. And you won't be around to stop us." Haneen chuckled, though the sound was hollow. "You'll never win, Hill. People like me always find a way." Margaret stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "And people like me will always be there to bring you down," she said. "Enjoy the view while you can, Haneen. It's all downhill from here." Haneen's smirk faltered as the agents guided him into the van, slamming the door shut behind him. The vehicle pulled away, its flashing lights reflecting off the jubilant crowd. As the van disappeared from view, Margaret turned to face the swarm of reporters that had gathered near the gates. She had anticipated this moment, knowing the media would demand answers. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, the cacophony of questions washing over her. Agent Hill, what can you tell us about the charges against Lieutenant Haneen? Does this arrest signal a larger investigation into the department? Is the FBI prepared for backlash from Haneen's supporters? Margaret raised a hand, signaling for silence. The crowd quieted, their attention fixed on her. Lieutenant Greg Haneen's arrest is a significant step forward in our fight against corruption, she began, her voice steady and authoritative. But let me be clear, this investigation isn't about one man. It's about addressing a system that allowed this corruption to thrive. The FBI remains committed to rooting out those who abuse their power, no matter how high their rank or how deep their connections. The reporters jotted down her words, their cameras capturing every moment. Margaret knew the narrative would shift quickly. Some would hail the FBI's efforts as a victory, while others would criticize them for not acting sooner. Either way, the story was far from over. Later that evening, Margaret sat in her office, the day's events replaying in her mind, the weight of the investigation, the challenges they had faced, and the lives that had been affected. All of it felt heavier now that the adrenaline had faded. Her phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen. It was Harris. She picked up, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "Harris!" "You did good today," Harris said, his tone lighter than usual. "The arrest went smoothly, and the community's response has been overwhelmingly positive." Margaret exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "We've won this battle," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "But the fight isn't over. Corruption like this doesn't end with one man." Harris paused, then replied, "No, it doesn't. But you've shown people that change is possible. That's a win, Margaret. Don't lose sight of that." Margaret nodded, though Harris couldn't see her. "Thanks," she said. But there's still a lot of work to do. As the city settled into the aftermath of Haneen's arrest, Margaret couldn't ignore the complexities of the situation. The Ledger had revealed the breadth of Haneen's network, implicating not just officers within the department, but also influential figures beyond it. The task ahead was daunting, but Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. She glanced at the evidence board in her office, a web of connections that all led back to Haneen's name. With a marker, she drew a line through his photo, a small but symbolic gesture. The battle against corruption was far from over, but for the first time, Margaret felt they were making progress. As she left her office that night, the echoes of protesters' chants still lingered in her mind. Justice for all. It was a promise she intended to keep. The precinct was quiet now, the earlier chaos having dissipated with the departure of agents, officers, and reporters. Margaret Hill lingered in her office, the faint hum of the overhead light the only sound breaking the silence. The day had been a victory, but the weight of it pressed heavily on her shoulders. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the evidence board that had been her constant companion throughout the investigation. Haneen's photo was crossed out, but the web of connections remained, sprawling and unresolved. The names of officers, officials, and accomplices tied to his corruption stared back at her, a sobering reminder of the work that still lay ahead. The satisfaction of his arrest felt hollow in light of the larger battle they were waging. Her thoughts drifted to Ryan Steele. His face lingered in her mind, not as the arrogant officer who had assaulted her, but as the broken man she had seen in the cell. His death weighed heavily on her, not because he was innocent, he wasn't, but because he had been a symptom of the very system she was trying to dismantle. Steele's corruption and abuses of power were reprehensible. Yet, in his final moments, he had been just another pawn in Haneen's game, discarded when he was no longer useful. Margaret couldn't shake the image of him sitting in that cell, trembling with fear, trapped between his own guilt and the terror of what Haneen might do to him. She let out a heavy sigh, rubbing her temples to ease the ache in her chest. "We failed him," she murmured to the empty room. "Not as a cop, but as a human being." Steele's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a stark reminder of the stakes. The system they were fighting was ruthless, and its reach extended further than she had initially imagined. Margaret stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the city. The faint glow of streetlights illuminated the streets below, where protesters had gathered just hours earlier. Their chants still echoed in her mind. Justice for all. End police corruption. She admired their passion, their determination to hold those in power accountable. But she also understood the cost of what they were demanding. Justice wasn't a single moment or arrest. It was a marathon, a battle, fought incrementally, and every step forward came with its own sacrifices. The faces of people who had trusted the system and been failed by it swam through her thoughts. Families torn apart, communities betrayed, lives destroyed. Haneen's arrest might bring some closure, but it wouldn't undo the damage. It wouldn't erase the years of fear and distrust ingrained in the community. Margaret reflected on her own role in the fight. She had chosen this path because she believed in the principles of justice and accountability. But the events of the past weeks had tested her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. The confrontation with Steele had been personal, his attack a physical manifestation of the power dynamics she had dedicated her career to dismantling. Yet, she couldn't help but wonder if there was more she could have done to save him. Could she have pushed harder during their conversation, found a way to protect him from Haneen's reach? She shook her head, dispelling the thought. Steele had made his choices, and they had brought him to that cell. But that didn't absolve her, or the system, from its failures. "This was just one precinct," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The system is broken, but we'll keep fighting until it's rebuilt." Margaret returned to her desk and picked up the leather-bound ledger that had been the key to Haneen's downfall. As damning as its contents were, it was also a symbol of hope. Every name, every transaction, was a thread that could unravel the corruption that had festered for so long. She flipped through the pages again, her resolve hardening with each entry. The fight was far from over, but this ledger was proof that change was possible. They had exposed Haneen, and now they could go after the others. Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking her train of thought. It was a message from Harris. "Good work today. The community is watching. Rest up. We've got a long road ahead." Margaret allowed herself a small, tired smile. Harris was right. The road ahead was long, but tonight's victory had proven that progress was possible, even against a system designed to resist accountability. Margaret closed the ledger and stood, her movements deliberate. The weight of the day still pressed on her, but it was tempered by a renewed sense of purpose. Steele's death, Haneen's arrest, the community's cries for justice, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle, one she was determined to solve. She turned off the light in her office and stepped into the quiet hallway. The faint hum of activity from the night shift agents reached her ears. They were still working, following up on leads, securing evidence, and preparing for the next steps. The fight wasn't over, but Margaret Hill was ready to face whatever came next. She pushed open the door to the night air, the city sprawling before her like a canvas waiting to be painted anew. The voices of the protesters echoed faintly in her memory, their chant a reminder of why she had chosen this path. Justice for all. It was more than a slogan. It was a promise, and Margaret intended to keep it.